the trustees say that sometimes the Upsolve debtors are better prepared than some of the lawyers, just because the computer has done all this work to help them get organized. That's the kind of stuff that I would like to see more of. I would like to see TurboTax for, family law or debt collection and things like that.
Today on LawNext, Jonathan Pyle. By day, he is the Contract Performance Officer at Philadelphia Legal Assistance, where he's responsible for compliance, reporting, and implementing new uses of technology to analyze, streamline, and expand service delivery. But in the legal tech world, he is perhaps better known as the developer of Docassemble, an open-source document assembly application that has become widely popular in many sectors of the legal community and been widely adapted for a range of applications. This is Bob Ambrogi, and you are listening to LawNext, the podcast that features the innovators and entrepreneurs who are driving what's next in law. Before I get to today's interview, let's hear about the sponsors who make this podcast possible. Are you having trouble managing it all? From billing, online payments, time tracking, e-signatures, case management to client communications, and more. Practice Panther is the all-in-one law practice management software designed to automate the innermost workings of your practice so you can focus on what matters, practicing the law. To learn more about the preferred solution trusted by tens of thousands of lawyers, visit practicepanther.com. Now, on to my interview with Jonathan Pyle. Jonathan Pyle, welcome to LawNext.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to speak with you. I always feel like it's a little bit of a small world thing when I talk to you, since even long before I ever met you, I knew your brother, who is a First Amendment media lawyer here in the Boston area. And in my day job, I do work with newspapers and cross paths with your brother on a fairly regular basis. So I want to talk, of course, about Docassemble, but I'm kind of curious if we could just kind of start with your own backstory a little bit. I'm curious. I read that you started programming at a really early age. So how did you get started in programming? And then how did that lead you eventually to going to law school?
I started programming on an IBM PC in the 80s when I was a kid. I was never very good at it. In fact, I was actually digging up my old floppy disks, and my brother was a better programmer than I was, which really made me mad.
With the big floppy disks, what were they, 5 and a quarter, something like that?
Yeah, the 5 1/4 floppies, yeah.
Yeah.
No, but I was always fascinated by computers, and I tinkered with them when I was a kid and a teenager. And then I went off to college where I majored in physics, but I really wanted to get into something involving social justice. So I went to law school, following in my brother's footsteps, and then ended up at a big firm. Although I noticed that at the big firm that there were so many things that were so ridiculously inefficient. So I just started to write code. I brought in a second computer that the law firm's IT department didn't approve of, and installed Linux on it and started creating web applications for managing discovery, because I didn't want to deal with the inefficiencies of what they had. So I found that as much as I try to practice law, I end up spending about half my time doing computer programming. And so I've become better at it. And I then ended up in legal aid after being a management consultant for a little while. And then I found there were all sorts of needs for computer programming and legal aid to create access to justice applications for low-income people to solve their legal problems through the web. And so around 2015, I started writing Docassemble in my spare time on my laptop.
In your spare time, nights and weekends, right? I wanted to ask. It was I hadn't been aware of this, but just in preparing for today's interview, I came across this fact that you had been involved in this very interesting kind of First Amendment free expression court case while you were still in high school. Is that right? And you and your brother.
The whole thing started actually when
bring you to law school at all? Did that in middle school?
Well, it totally did. So you mentioned my brother. He's a media lawyer, the First Amendment lawyer. Well, First Amendment goes way back, because when I was in middle school and my brother was in high school, our school district tried to pass a very restrictive dress code to target T-shirts with messages on them. And my brother and I, our father is a constitutional law professor. So he told us all about what the Constitution says about the issue and the Tinker versus Des Moines case. And so we wore T-shirts to school to sort of deliberately violate the dress code to see what would happen. And eventually a lawsuit grew out of it where we were represented by the Massachusetts ACLU. And we won the case, and the dress code was struck down as unconstitutional. So I think that kind of cemented the fact that we both wanted to go to law school and do stuff like that.
I would have thought so. I mean, that was a case that involved there was a question presented to the Mass Supreme Judicial Court and went up through the federal courts. It was quite anybody can who Googles your name these days is going to find that case because it comes up. So also just curious again before we get to Docassemble, I'm just curious about what caused you to go from private practice to management consulting and then into legal services. What was it about legal services that drew you there?
I think I always wanted to do like impact litigation. And I worked as a summer associate at Community Legal Services in Philadelphia when I was in law school. So the idea of using my law degree to help low-income people with civil matters is something that always appealed to me. I basically followed the crowd and went to a big firm for a while, but I always thought I would do something in the public interest. In fact, when I was at the firm, we were like bringing cases on behalf of Iraqi detainees who were tortured by government contractors during the Iraq War. So I'd always done stuff in that area. So I was kind of magnetically drawn back to working in the public interest world.
Yeah. When you first went into working in legal services, and I mentioned what your day job is, but why don't you tell us what is your day job? But what do you do for Philadelphia Legal Assistance?
I work in management and administration, and I just do a number of things to help the organization run more efficiently. My job title is Contract Performance Officer, so I kind of make funders happy. But there's actually quite a lot that I get involved in, particularly around docket data, like trying to understand what goes on in these high volume courts that we have for mortgage foreclosure and eviction. Like in eviction, 20,000 people go through the process every year. A lot of them don't even show up. Like, how do we prevent that? Like, how do we restore housing stability to folks? And it helps to be able to analyze these systems at that sort of data level. And so I download the data from the court websites and build databases and do all sorts of analyses and facilitate diversion programs. So we're trying to resolve these cases outside of court as much as possible. So I do a lot of stuff involving like lists of dockets and sending mass mailings to people and helping advocates understand what's happening on a systemic level so that they can address it maybe with class actions or advocacy with the court. So that takes up a lot of my time as well. I sometimes build applications with Docassemble. For example, we needed to help landlords satisfy judgments in our local municipal court, and there was no easy way for them to do that. So I built an app that automatically sort of e-files the order of satisfaction of judgment. And that's just something I did in the past few months.
Yeah. Yeah. Has your analysis of this docket data from housing courts or eviction cases led to any insights as to how to, help defendants in those cases avoid eviction or resolve cases in more favorable ways?
It actually, there's a lot that can be done. I have been very helpful in feeding the data to other researchers. There's a law professor at Penn Law who's taken my data, and I actually gave him the PDFs of the leases in hundreds of thousands of cases. And he had a postdoc work on a project doing optical character recognition on all of the leases, then classifying them and determining that there were certain lease forms that were being used in different parts of the city, and that then the form of the lease, the form of the contract, would affect outcomes in some statistically measurable way. He also found that the distance between the person's home and the court affected the default judgment rate, which is a good argument for having community-based courts that are closer to where people live, in the hopes that they would take advantage of their rights more often. And the data that I've produced has been helpful for systemic changes like the passage of right to counsel in eviction cases, like being able to demonstrate the inequality between 80% of landlords being represented and only 8% of tenants being represented has helped policymakers understand the gravity of the situation. And so there have been policy changes that are informed by the data.
That's really interesting. I'm forgetting the name of the program at Harvard Law that's been trying to do a lot of sort of evidence-based data analysis of outcomes in different kinds of courts, including in housing courts. And I remember being struck by a study they did a number of years ago now on, I think it was eviction cases, outcomes in eviction cases, but it looked at whether having full representation by a lawyer or just partial representation by a lawyer, such as, lawyer for the day program or something like that, impacted the outcome. And I think one of the surprising findings of that was that the less than full representation often resulted in better outcomes than the full representation, which is probably not what a lot of lawyers wanted to hear. But, it just shows that when you can actually pull together data and analyze data regarding what's going on in the courts, which is something people didn't used to do, you can learn things that you might never have expected about outcomes.
Yeah, and just the sheer volume of cases, you can tell right away that there's never going to be enough funding for giving everybody full representation. There has to be some other system. And so that's what we work on is systems that provide representation to those who need it, but resolve the issues in other ways for those who can get a good outcome without representation.
Yeah. So, as you said, in your spare time, you developed Docassemble. What is it? What is Docassemble?
So Docassemble is kind of like Hot Docs, if people have heard of Hot Docs, or Neota Logic. It is a guided interview platform for creating web apps that ask one question at a time of a user, that are very mobile friendly and as well as desktop friendly, in order to assemble a legal document or just provide some other form of assistance, like maybe a summary of what your rights are given the information you've provided. It's a tool for automating the practice of law, which I hope people do more and more. I think lawyers could be very efficient if they create websites where as much of their legal thought goes into the website as possible. And then in the exception cases, they can provide one-on-one service. One of the best uses of Docassemble has been the bankruptcy platform Upsolve, which used Docassemble for a couple of years as their questionnaire. This allowed low-income people who would otherwise have to pay $2,000 to a private attorney to go on a website and be asked a series of questions, kind of like TurboTax. And then at the end of it, a bankruptcy Chapter 7 petition would be created. It would be reviewed by a lawyer or advocate, but that review would not take an immense amount of time, maybe 5-10 minutes, address any problems. There would be a human review component, but then the person would get their petition that they could then file pro se in bankruptcy court. And they are able to serve thousands of people a year through that system who would otherwise have to spend $2,500 on a bankruptcy lawyer. And so that's been very successful. The trustees say that sometimes the Upsolve debtors are better prepared than some of the lawyers, just because the computer has done all this work to help them get organized. And that's the kind of stuff that I would like to see more of. I would like to see TurboTax for, family law or debt collection and things like that. And so that was my motivation for creating the system. I wanted there to be sophisticated applications. There are a lot of great applications that have already been created. In fact, we've been doing automation of legal work since the 80s, but typically the systems are really designed for lawyers to use directly, for relatively simple form filling applications. And I wanted to encourage the really advanced applications that manage a great deal of complexity. And for that, I brought in the power of general purpose computer programming. So you can use Docassemble to create a fairly simple form, but then there's no limit on what you can do complexity wise, because you can use the same kind of code that a professional computer programmer would have access to.
Jonathan Pyle developed Docassemble as a tool for automating the practice of law. As you heard him say, one of the best examples of how it can be used is the bankruptcy platform Upsolve, which used it to create a sort of TurboTax for bankruptcy law, enabling low-income people to prepare their own Chapter 7 petitions and avoid the cost of hiring a lawyer. When we return, we'll talk about Jonathan's decision to make the software free and open source, and we'll discuss other ways in which Docassemble is being used to automate the delivery of legal services. But first, let's hear about the sponsors, whose generosity supports this podcast. Tired of endless open tabs and jumping from program to program? Practice Panther is used by tens of thousands of lawyers to manage their practices all in one place. Easily track time, process online payments, send documents for e-signatures, send business text messages, and so much more, all without leaving the platform. Learn how Practice Panther can automate your business at practicepanther.com. Welcome back to LawNext. This is Bob Ambrogi, and I am speaking with Jonathan Pyle, developer of Docassemble, an application for created guided interviews to help automate legal document assembly and the delivery of legal services. While there are other commercial document assembly applications in the legal market, Jonathan made his software open source, which means it's available for anyone to use at no cost. As we return, I ask him about that decision to make it open source and why there isn't more open source software in the legal market. I'm trying to remember who it was that somebody I spoke to recently. I think I remember who it was, but I don't want to say it in the recording because I might have it wrong. But I had a conversation not long ago. Well, I was actually back when I was at ABA Tech Show a few weeks ago with a founder of a legal tech company who was a programmer who said, "Have you ever heard of this thing called Docassemble?" And, "Yeah, of course I've heard of it." And he said, "I'd never heard of it." He said, "I just started playing with it. It's amazing. It's just amazing. It's on one level, it's so easy, but on another level, it's just so complex. There's nothing you can't do with this." He was just raving on and on about Docassemble. Given the source, and I could tell you offline who it was. It was quite an endorsement for that. But you mentioned like hot docs. What was wrong with hot docs? What was wrong with what was already available on the market before you developed Docassemble?
So one of the limitations with hot docs was that the desktop app could do a lot of cool stuff like talk to a database, but the web-based version of the app didn't have those features. And the problem that I encountered with hot docs and some of the other ones that are being used in legal aid was that problems that I found to be rather simple in my history of computer programming, like a nested for loop. It's like looping over the plaintiffs and then looping over the children of each plaintiff. To me, that's a very simple thing to approach. But I remember going to a conference where we were talking about hot docs and doing a nested for loop required all sorts of complicated workarounds. And I thought, why does it have to be this hard? Like, why can't we just use regular old computer code? I grew up with the basic computer programming language in the 80s, and it's really simple. So that's where I felt the need to have an open source alternative. And also, I think it's just because of the cost. To use Neota Logic, you have to pay a great deal of money each month. And a lot of folks, even at firms, are very cost conscious. And so being able to have open source software operate your system means that you can use it for as long as you want. You can stop using it. It doesn't cost you any fees. You also have total control over where you store client data. Because a lot of these new services are software as a service, which means the data lives in the cloud somewhere, and the company could, stop operating at any moment, and then who has your data? Whereas with Docassemble, it's just software, so you can keep close tabs on your client confidential information.
Yeah. And you have, as you said, chosen to make this open source and freely available. Do you make any money off of this? Do you want to make any money off of this?
No, I really like not making money off of it because I really like being able to be totally honest with people. Like I had a conversation with a firm that was thinking about using it, and I was really excited about them using it. But then they told me that their end goal was to have like unsophisticated paralegals be the ones to do the interview creation. And so I advised them not to use my software. I like being able to advise people not to use my code.
Yeah. And
it's just so much easier if I can just concentrate on the technology and developing new features and not have to worry about making a living. So it's kind of nice to have it be something you do on the nights and weekends rather than a day job.
Yeah. I mean, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, having open source software and commercializing it in some way. I mean, other companies have done that, in like Red Hat, right, or something like that, where they have open source software that's there's a way to commercialize it. But did you have a kind of a thought process about making this open source? I mean, what was the decision to make it open source simply to make it more widely available, or as you said, to not sort of have people coming back at you and, with customer complaints and wanting customer service or something like that?
Well, really, it's because I've always been a Linux user, and I've always really loved the Free Software Foundation and Richard Stallman and all that. So I guess it's kind of like a ideological commitment. I just love the whole concept of releasing stuff open source and free and not having to worry about it. So I think that's the main reason I did it. But it also makes it kind of easy because with the open source world, you have access to all of this great open source code. Like if I wanted to read QR codes or it's very simple to just use somebody else's package and add that functionality. I don't have to write it from scratch.
Right. So you can just go out and go on to Stack or somewhere and find what fits for what you want to get done, and it makes it a lot easier to customize this or develop it for different applications. I good friends with a guy named John Tredenick, who's been kind of started this open source foundation for law. Do you have any thoughts on why we don't see more open source software in the legal technology world?
I think it's largely because law firms don't really like using open source software. And it's not so much that they have a bias toward proprietary software and against open source. I think in the 90s, open source had this reputation as being, like the generic items in the grocery store. Like they weren't as good as the name brand stuff. And that has definitely fallen by the wayside. But I think law firms still don't really want to use it because they want to be able to purchase something, have a support contract, and just have a tidy way of dealing with the software. Whereas if you commit to using open source software, you have to take all that responsibility yourself and deploy it. And you don't have anybody else to blame if there's something in it that is insecure. So there's a lot of extra stuff to worry about. I think law firms are very cost conscious and they like the fact that open source software doesn't have the licensing fees, but it all boils down to total cost of ownership. They might have to train their people to know how to use it, and that costs money. So at the end of the day, they decide to opt for whatever Microsoft is offering or one of the big companies. That seems to be the big issue. And I'm on the advisory board of Tredenick's foundation, and I hope we can popularize the use of open source software in firms of all sizes. Because I think what I look forward to is a world where law firms have smart coders who work on automating the stuff for the benefit of their attorneys and their law firm clients. And then they all sort of contribute to this shared software infrastructure. And that's not what they compete with each other over. They don't compete with each other for the infrastructure. They like having good infrastructure for everybody, but then they compete on the applications and products and services.
Yeah.
And I think the corporate world does that pretty well. I would just like to see the law firm world do that. There's certain base of technology of stuff that lawyers have to deal with, especially around manipulation of PDF files. You go to law school and you think you're going to be arguing in front of the Supreme Court, and now you're using Adobe Acrobat to put Bates numbers on things. We could solve a lot of problems for all of us if we work together around an open source code base to make law really efficient.
Yeah. You mentioned Upsolve. Can you give other examples that stand out to you of instances where Docassemble has been used to productive ends in the legal world?
In Boston, there was a project going on at Greater Boston Legal Services involving eviction defense clinics, where people could come in and prepare all the documents related to defending against their eviction. And one of the people there started using Docassemble to prepare those documents instead. And he created this very complex eviction defense system. Yeah, Quentin, who now works at Suffolk Law.
Yeah.
But when he was at Greater Boston, he created a whole eviction defense system, which really highlighted some of the additional functionality that open source software will give you. He was doing stuff with getting lists of court addresses from the internet and bringing it in and having it automatically populate things. Stuff advanced stuff like that you can't easily do with one of the commercial systems. So that's been a very successful system. And now Quentin is trying to amplify that by working at Suffolk and has lots of projects going on now.
Right. There was another pandemic-related one in Suffolk. I'm forgetting what it was now, but where they were using Docassemble to help
Sure.
forms. You
Like
may remember that.
CDC declarations and all sorts of stuff. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And then, I mean, there have been other, I guess, if you want to call Upsolve commercial, which it is, I guess it's a business, but there have been other commercial applications as well. I mean, I know the company Documate was using it. I don't know if they still are, but they had Dorna Moini, the founder of that company, had originally started out with a project to help women obtain domestic violence restraining orders, and I think was using Docassemble to create that, and then that sort of evolved into a broader company, I guess, in mission for what she was doing. Right? Do I have that right?
Yeah, and also Community Lawyer, which then turned into Afterpattern and then was bought by NetDocuments. They used Docassemble at the beginning to launch their system. Now, I never actually intended anybody to use Docassemble and then like put a graphical, user-friendly front end on it. I've always intended it to be the sort of advanced system that you use where the interview developer writes code.
Yeah.
There are lots of no-code products out there already. So if you want to do no code, you don't have to use Docassemble. But yeah, they were able to launch fairly quickly because there was already a document assembly infrastructure with Docassemble.
Yeah. Yeah. Why did you not want people to put sort of a graphical user interface on the front end of it? It was something you didn't want, or you just hadn't really kind of thought it through in that way?
Well, my view about the whole no code stuff is that it is very good for a certain level of complexity in your legal application. And then when you want that complexity to increase, then the difficulty of using no code sort of exponentially increases along with it. Whereas if you were using text-based ways of telling the computer what to do, you can take advantage of all of these techniques that computer programmers have been using for decades to make that complexity manageable. Like object orientation is a huge thing to simplify complexity. And you can use that in Docassemble. And there's really just no way to make a drag and drop system handle all of the complexity that computer programmers deal with every day. So I have always wanted to provide the code-based, the yes code alternative to all the no-code platforms. But I do recognize that the market for no-code is much larger because people do want a system that any old paralegal can just use.
Yeah. You're in the legal services world. How is Docassemble being used by legal services organizations to help, address the justice gap in this country?
It's being used by a few. I'm not familiar with all the things that they've created, but forms for court pleadings and things like that. I think it's being used in divorce, landlord-tenant areas like that. But I do think that generally the legal services world is fairly well served by Pro Bono Net, which has A2J Author, and which connects with Hot Docs.
Right.
It's easier to use for the type of people who get hired in legal aid. It seems like most people who use Docassemble are more small firms. A typical user is an attorney who likes technology. They don't have to have a background in computer programming, but if they just really like solving technology problems, they start developing an app and then they make it more and more complex. Like I've got somebody in Washington State who is doing optical character recognition on discovery requests and then automatically figuring out where each paragraph begins and ends and preparing the response to the discovery request right then and there. Very advanced stuff that I've never even attempted myself, but they just like it. They like figuring it out. There was another user who in Philadelphia who was a state's lawyer, and he said every day he would come in an hour early, and between 8 and 9 in the morning, he'd teach himself how to automate his work. And he had never done computer programming before. And after several months, he was able to use Docassemble to reduce the amount of time it took him to do a will for somebody from 1 hour to 5 minutes. And that type of stuff is great. Reduces the cost of legal services for everybody, which is really kind of my goal.
Yeah. I yesterday, just thinking about this interview, I just put a thing up on Twitter saying, who's using Docassemble and what are you using it for? And I got quite a number of responses from people from all over the world. There was one person saying the teams of Swiss law students used it to learn about programming and nonprofit organizations and build bylaws generators at the Swiss Legal Tech Open. Somebody in Australia was mentioning using it for something, which I'm not seeing right now. Here's somebody saying we built the working prototype of California's fine reduction request app using Docassemble.
Yeah, the California court system used it for that. And apparently it saved Californians $750,000 or something.
In programming costs.
Or no, just in fines.
And
fines avoided.
Okay, I was going to say, even in programming costs, probably. Yeah, they probably would have put out some crazy contract to develop that. But I mean, that must feel pretty good to you to see it get so widely adopted and used like that.
Yeah, it's great. We have a Slack group where Docassemble users can help each other out with problems, and there are people from all over the world. I counted 14 different countries, but there may be more. And so I get requests at all hours of the day from people who are working on things, some of which I don't totally understand. And sometimes they communicate over Slack via Google Translate. Like they translate their question and they translate my response. So it's a real open source is a real international thing.
Yeah.
Lots of stuff going on in South America. Brazil is a hotspot for legal tech.
Yeah.
For example.
Yeah. And you have, in addition to the Slack group, you have created a kind of an annual, I don't know if you call it a conference or what, around Docassemble.
Yes, we've been having DocaCon since 2017. In the past few years, it's been remote, but before that, we had one in Chicago and one in Brooklyn. And then there is planned, the next one is going to take place in June in the UK. So the first international DocaCon should be taking place pretty soon.
Face-to-face, a live program, or?
I don't think that's been decided yet. We're seeing how it goes.
Yeah. Who goes to that? What happens there?
All sorts of folks have come to the DocaCons. Sometimes it's people who do contract law at big firms, or it's legal aid people, or people from random people on the internet. I don't know quite what they do.
Yeah.
Anybody who's interested in automating stuff, and sometimes it's not even in the legal field, although that was my intention. Like somebody's using it to scan passports for some. So yeah, it's a really, really diverse international group of people who come to these conferences.
What else are you working on? Are you working on developing any other technology applications in your spare time, your nights and weekends?
I have an open source system that I started developing before Docassemble that I have never really completed for managing the large volume of documents that lawyers have to deal with in discovery and when preparing for a case. So maybe at some point I will get back to working on that, a way to sort of put all of your knowledge about a large litigation case into the computer in a structured and computable fashion. I don't know that there's going to be a huge market for it, because there are plenty of e-discovery vendors out there already. But that's one of the things I have on the back burner. But mostly I spend my time adding new features to Docassemble. Like I'm working on a way to use the Google Vision API to do optical character recognition. If somebody has like a large volume of things to OCR, that's what I was working on the other day.
Yeah.
And just making it more robust and secure and following the latest security protocols. That's a lot of work.
Yeah, I think you go to. I think I've seen you at the Legal Services Corporation's annual tech conference, TIG conference. They used to call it, what do they call it? Innovations in Tech Now conference or something like that. Right. That they call it now. Having worked in private firms and in the private sector and at legal services, how would you kind of rate the adoption of tech within the legal services world, the use of tech?
I think it's superb. And maybe that's kind of surprising because we often assume that, the big firms, they have so much resources that they can do all sorts of modern stuff. But in reality, they don't necessarily. Like I've been to conferences geared toward law firms, and the things they talk about are kind of boring. Whereas I go to the legal aid nonprofit conference and there's a lot of excitement and people experimenting. And I think a lot of that is due to the Legal Services Corporation itself for having the whole idea of the Technology and Initiative Grants Program and encouraging people to apply for grants and try new things. So there's a lot of really creative thinking going on in the legal aid space, particularly around user interfaces and user experience and making sure that we optimize technology to be understandable to a wide variety of people. And, that blends over not just into technology, but like making sure the user experience in a courthouse it runs smoothly. The legal aid, I love being in the nonprofit legal aid space just because there's so much creative thinking and energy around.
Yeah, the energy. I mean, if you go to that conference, the enthusiasm and excitement around the potential for using technology to enhance the work that they do is really palpable in a way that it isn't always if you go to Legal Week in New York or something. But do you think is there more of a sort of a DIY mentality in the legal services world? I mean, there isn't a lot of money in the legal services world for technology. I mean, it's great that there are products such as yours that don't cost any money, but I often feel that there is a little bit more of a, like I said, more of a DIY mentality within legal services organizations.
Yeah, that happens a lot. Like somebody will be a lawyer at a legal aid program, and then they will see a need for something, and they can just create it. They teach themselves to code, and then they create like a website that tracks outreach or something like that. I've seen that happen. Whereas in the law firm world, I think if people did have those ideas, they couldn't get their firms to adopt them because they would be afraid that something would go wrong. And so, maybe they'll leave and start a startup. Like it might happen that way instead of like in-house.
Well, Jonathan, that's all the questions I had. Anything else that you'd like to say about Docassemble or about anything else we've been talking about here today?
Well, I would encourage people to check it out, especially if you are a lawyer and you like computers, you like technology or technical things. You might find that it's just fun. Then you might find once you've learned how to do stuff that you'll start seeing problems that you didn't even know were solvable with technology, and you'll think of some innovative thing to do. To start using Docassemble, you can go to the website docassemble.org and learn how to install it on Amazon Web Services or wherever you choose to install it.
And there's a lot of documentation there as well. I mean, you don't kind of leave people entirely to their own resources in terms of trying to get up to speed on this.
Yeah, the documentation is pretty comprehensive. It has lots of examples, and you can join our Slack group, and anybody can just come on the Slack group and say, "Oh, I'm trying to do this," and either I or somebody else will, show them how, and I even write code for them and show them the way, and you sort of learn by doing incrementally that way.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot. Thanks for all your work on this. Thanks for making it free and open source and available to the legal community, and keep up the good work.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
It's been a pleasure. I've been speaking today with Jonathan Pyle, the developer of the open source document assembly and guided interview software Docassemble. Thanks to Jonathan for taking the time to join me today. What are your thoughts on today's show? Share them by tweeting us at LawNext Podcast. LawNext is produced, engineered, and edited by Populous Radio. I'm your host, Bob Ambrogi. I hope you'll join us again next time for another episode of LawNext.